Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to show you that not only is it the end of times, but we have reached the finality of knowledge. Now, it is always true, this concept is always true. There is a constant unknown in our perception. Our perception has an unknown constant. We can never lose this concept of an unknown constant. The reason behind this is very simple. We are temporal beings. The dimension of time is singular, sequential, linear, and of course temporal, right? Now, I want you to understand this. It is written in the Quran, my last video, empirically, quantitatively, and algorithmically proved that the Quran is the word of God. It is divine revelation. By extension, so is the Bible, so is the Torah. So the religions of Islam, Christianity, Judaism have been validated. This is the truth. Now, as people, it is not our duty to know. Our purpose in life is to worship God, because God is all-knowing and all-powerful. In order to be all-knowing, very simply, God has no unknown constant. It is a very simple thought experiment. Do you know what's going to happen the next moment? No, you don't. Or about an hour from now, do you understand what will happen in our reality? Not at all. This unknown constant is embedded into our framework of being conscious of this reality. This framework, there's an unknown constant that is always embedded. Here's something that is very interesting. Now, it is written in the Quran, the earth and heavens were created. And when they were created, what was instantiated was the dimension of time. So very simply, heaven also has a singular, sequential, linear, temporal dimension of time. So, it is often said that the earth is the lower heaven. So, the upper heavens and the lower heavens have what? A dimension of time. What is very interesting, if you study the intricacies of heaven, you understand that there are 7 levels of heaven. I again connect this to Einstein's theory of relativity. The faster time moves, the more pleasurable your experience. If you're with good company, friends, loved ones, whoever, time moves very fast. Good company, time moves very fast. Now you put your hand on the stove, time moves very slow. The worse you feel, time moves slower and slower. The better you feel, time moves faster and faster. Now in the Quran, there is an ayah which states that 1 day in heaven is equivalent to 1,000 earth years. What does that mean? That means time moves faster in heaven. Specifically, if you analyze the ayah in the Quran, you know that in heaven, time moves at the speed of light. Now, the speed of light is so fast, you can do whatever you literally want. You know, if you want to go fishing, if you want to go to the movies, I'm saying in heaven, right? So, I'm not too certain if the movies or fishing are activities you do in heaven, but let's say you want to go fishing in heaven with your parents or your family. You want to go to the movies with your partner, whatever. Like that, all of that is possible in heaven. And it's at the speed of light, so things are almost simultaneous. It like you can do one activity, then the next, because you're moving at the speed of light. So the DC character, the Flash, you're moving at the speed of the Flash. So you can do one activity, the next, and the next, right? So in heaven, we move at the speed of light. That's why just by standing still in heaven, things are very pleasurable. Why are they pleasurable? Again, the Quran states, moving at the speed of light, time moves so fast, just by being alive in heaven, of course, very inherent, very clear, things are very pleasurable. Now, one thing I do want to state though, because time also has a linear sequential parameter, heaven, there's also a constant of the unknown. Because there's a constant of the unknown in heaven, what does this mean? For human beings, whether you're in this reality of the universe and earth, or whether in the afterlife with heaven, what does this mean if there's a constant unknown? Our premise in life, our purpose in life is not to know, but to worship God. Because for God, there is no unknown constant. Now, why is there no unknown constant in the domain of God? Because the domain of God is atemporal. God is the master of time, and therefore there is no dimension of time when it concerns the domain of God. So because of that, there is no unknown constant. That means literally, because it is atemporal, God's existence is one infinitesimal finite moment. For God, the beginning and the end is one infinitesimal, which means extremely small moment, extremely short moment. And for us, regardless if we're in the universe or in heaven, it is an infinite number of moments until you reach eternity, or the end point of eternity, whatever you want to mention. It's an infinite number of sequential moments for us always, whether we're in this universe or heaven. And for God, his entire existence, the creator, the supreme creator's entire existence, from the beginning till the end, is one finite, infinitesimal, everly short moment. He does not experience time. There is no unknown at all for God. Now, when we compare the atemporal, or the lack of time in God's domain, with our linear sequential temporal dimension, with our singular linear arrow of time is what we have, with our singular dimension of time in God's atemporality, what do we understand? There's a duality when it comes to understanding time. There is time how we perceive it as the creation and slaves of God, and how the almighty supreme creator God experiences time, which he doesn't, because he's the master of time. Now let's talk about some mathematics. When it comes to the terminology of infinity, we assume that infinity is the highest element that we can comprehend. Now, in advanced mathematics, there's a concept of alephes. Alephes are higher levels of infinity. This terminology comes from the Hebrew word aleph. Aleph is also an Arabic word, but when it comes to the domain of mathematics, alephs are higher levels of infinity. So you might ask yourself, how can there be higher levels of infinity? Very simple. We have counting numbers. That is the most fundamental essence of the number line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Counting numbers. Then we have integers. Integers are whole numbers, but they could also be negative numbers. -2, -3, -4. Right? So integers versus counting numbers. If both integers and counting numbers approach infinity, right? So these are limits. We know that the infinity of counting numbers will be the infinity of integers will be greater than counting numbers. Because we know with integers, we include negative numbers and positive numbers. With counting numbers, it's just positive numbers. So if both of these sets, right, this is sets of infinity. If the set of infinity of counting numbers versus the set of infinity of integers, we know the set of infinity of integers is greater than the set of infinity of counting numbers. We also know this. If we look at decimals, right? So 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, the set of infinity for decimals, negative 2.3, negative 2.4, the set of infinity for decimals would be a lot greater than the set of infinity for integers and for counting numbers. This example shows that there's levels to infinity. So very simply, because different sets have different hierarchies, infinity times infinity is very simply infinity squared. Infinity times infinity times infinity very simply is infinity to the third. Well, by this logic, what we can also create is infinity to the infinity power, right? So I wrote a couple of diagrams. Hopefully you can see them well. This right here, x is equal to infinity to the power of infinity raised to the power of infinity raised to the power of infinity raised to the power of infinity. Right, so this is equal to x, for example, right? It's probably backwards, but you understand what I'm saying, right? So what am I ultimately getting at? There is a concept called the alpha set. The alpha set is a set of infinity that can never be beta. Now, this concept of the alpha set is theoretical. Again, the definition is a set of infinity that could never be beta. So just to give you an illustration of how grandiose the alpha set is, let me give you an example. So this, infinity to the power of infinity to the power of infinity is equal to x, right? And then right here, x to the power of x to the power of x to the power of x is equal to y, right? And then over here, y to the power of y to the power of y to the power of y is equal to z. Z, again, we start off with infinity to the power of infinity. That is equal to x. X to the power of x, that is equal to y. Y to the power of y, that is equal to z, right? Well, guess what? Z is nothing compared to the alpha set. Z is nothing compared to the alpha set. Even if we were in heaven, literally, where the speed of our comprehension and perception is the speed of light, we can never fully comprehend the alpha set, because again, the alpha set is a set of infinity that could never be beta. So we can never comprehend the alpha set even if we're in heaven moving at the speed of light. Even if our dimension of time, let's go even beyond heaven. What if our dimension of time was moving at 100 trillion meters per second? We still cannot comprehend the alpha set because it is the highest version, highest iteration of infinity possible. Now, the premise of this video is to show you that we have reached the finality of wisdom. We have mastered our linear sequential perception. So now this is where it gets interesting. The alpha set for our linear sequential framework of time and perception is the highest understood entity because it's a set of infinity that could never be beta, right? But for God is the master of time. There is no unknown constant for God. For God, this concept of the alpha set is nothing. Alpha set is equal to 0 in respects to the perception of the divine, the perception of God. Why is that true? Because our perception is always inferior to the perception of God. our perception is always inferior to God's divine perception because we have an unknown constant, and God does not have a concept of the unknown. So very simply, let me just draw this very quickly. We have an arrow of time. So this is the arrow of time. This is the concept of our dimension of time. This dot, that is the concept of God's perception of time. So we have an arrow that is approaching infinity. For God is a finite, infinitesimal moment. What does this mean? That means for God, any form of infinity is infinitesimal. In fact, since it is stated in the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, God is the greatest. If God is the greatest, God makes any form of infinity infinitesimal, because the alpha set is not God, and God is the greatest. That's where the magnitude of the divine, the magnitude of God, makes every other magnitude that isn't God into zero, into the most fundamental. Now let me explain this further. So, what is the magnitude of God? The magnitude of God is beyond our scope of comprehension, because we cannot fully even fathom the alpha set if we were moving at the speed of light. If we were in heaven and our minds are moving at the speed of light, we're literally moving at the speed of light, or even 100 trillion meters per second, the concept of the alpha set is never understood. However, the magnitude of the divine makes the alpha set zero, nothing. So God is well beyond our comprehension. And a lot of versions of the Quran state God is infinite love, God is infinite mercy. Infinity is not the right terminology to describe the immaculate magnitude of God, because infinity, again, alpha set is the highest order of infinity, and because infinity is a concept of our linear sequential perception, infinity is nothing compared to God. The alpha set, the highest order of infinity, which we can never conceptualize even in heaven, is nothing compared to God. So that's where God's perception is very Boolean. Boolean means ones and zeros. One is true, zero is false. So for God, the highest value that God can think of is the concept of himself. So the highest value God can think of is the value of God. So, does this mean that God can fully conceptualize himself? Of course he can. So for God, thinking about himself is quantifiable as if you're counting to the number one. God is equal to himself counting to the number one, right? So God is equal to one, and everything else that is not God is equal to zero, right? So, for example, the heavens compared to God, that's zero. God is one. Everyone else is zero. God is one, right? So it's a Boolean, it's ones and zeros. God is the highest one, and he can quantify himself, and everything else is zero. Now let me ask you a quick question. What if I said God squared? Does that make sense? No, it doesn't, because God squared, or God times 10, or 10 times God, this does not make sense, because the concept of God has been instantiated as what? God is the greatest. So God is the greatest. There is no concept of God squared. You cannot square the magnitude of the divine. You cannot square the magnitude of God. God is the greatest, so God is what? God is always the greatest, and God is the highest value that is beyond our scope of comprehension, but God is also the highest value that God can comprehend himself. But that does not mean God is not quantifiable in the godly perception. If God looks in the mirror, he sees himself, and he sees the value one, right? So what does this mean? We can never quantify God, even in heaven, a billion years moving forward in heaven. You know, we're moving at the speed of light, or a magnitude like 100 trillion meters per second. That speed of time still does not give us full awareness, does not give us full comprehension. How do you understand and master the human perception? You fully have to understand what are concepts that we will never fully able to conceptualize. And a concept we can never conceptualize is the magnitude of the divine, the magnitude of God. So that's where God is all-knowing, and our perception and our comprehension is inferior, it is faulty. We have no comprehension compared to the comprehension of the all-knowing God. And this concept, this duality of time, this temporal duality, connecting God's ultimate perception, where any high value we can think of that is not God, the alpha set for example, is equal to nothing, zero, in God's divine perception. Only thing that has significance is the value of God in God's perception. Everything else is zero. So in the Quran, there's the throne of God, the Arsh. The Arsh is zero compared to God. The heavens is zero compared to God. Everything is zero, but we know in God's perception, God is significant. Everything else, we have no significance. So why I bring this up, this is the finality of quantification of our perception. It is so final that we have fully quantified the heavenly perception too. And what is stated in the heavenly perception is that time moves at the speed of light. So we have understood so much that we know what we will never know even in heaven. This is why this is the finality of wisdom. This is the finality of logic. We are now understanding the limits of our perception in this life, the afterlife. We fully understand the framework of the godly perception, because everything that is not God is insignificant and zero. God, in his own perception, sees himself as one. And this concept of God as human beings, we can never conceptualize, because whatever is a high value in our minds that isn't God, again, is what? Zero. So why do I bring this up? Because we're zero compared to God, this gives you humility. We're absolutely nothing compared to God. If the entire scope of the heavens is nothing, the entire scope of the universe is nothing, we're so small compared to the universe, compared to the sun, compared to the earth. So we're just below nothing. All of us are below nothing. Life is not about material items, because if the human life is nothing compared to God, whatever material you have is absolutely nothing compared to God. What this gives us is modesty. It gives us humility. We bow down fully to God because we are absolute zero. We are absolute zero to God. So when we pray to God, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, there is no God but God. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last messenger. That's Islam. There is no God but God. Is Christian, is Jewish, it is, Judaism, Christianity. There is no God but God. God is the supreme. We're absolutely nothing. So when we bow down, everything is all about humility. We're so humble, right? So that is the quantification of God. What is the qualification? Qualification matters more than quantification. God's first name in Islam is Ar-Rahman, the most compassionate. God's second name is Ar-Rahim, the most merciful. So, in order to embody God's full intrinsic value, it's not quantification, because the divine is beyond the alpha set, the highest iteration of infinity. We understand that. But the divine is now multiplied with compassion and mercy. God has supreme character. So as slaves of God, as creations of God, we bow down fully, and we also reflect good character within, because if you are a creation of God, if you are devout, if you are a true believer of God, now what? You have to have good character. You don't just bow down, you exhibit excellence in character and integrity. That's what you have to do. All of the knowledge has been understood. We understand the concept of sifr, which is zero in Arabic, right? We are zero. The heavens are zero. everything we can perceive and conceptualize that isn't God is zero compared to the divine, to God. There is a surah in the Quran. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There is nothing compared to God. Nothing compares to God. So again, I have to say this. Let's believe. It is the end of times, the finality of wisdom. We have conceptualized things where we know things that we will never know in heaven. We have conceptualized the godly perception, a atemporal domain, a perception and comprehension that makes everything else that isn't the divine into a nullity, into zero. So all I have to say is this was a long video. This was very abstract. But what does it ultimately mean? Life is not about quantification. Quantification and intelligence only makes you more humble, only gives you more humility. Qualification of life is the most important. Your soul, your spirit, how it feels. Emotions are so important. Love, feel love. Forgive everyone. Forgive your enemies. There's a saying, when the victim and the abuser meet each other in heaven, they're actually best friends, and God starts laughing. Wow, you abused this guy. Oh, you abused this girl. And guess what? Now you're the best of friends in heaven. God starts laughing. That's what heaven is. Forgive your worst enemy. We're all friends. Nosotros familia. We're all family. And all I have to say is God bless you all. This was a long video, but guess what? It's not about the quantification. It was never about math. It was all about how you feel love, feel kindness, and give to each other. Subhanallah, God is always glorified. God bless.